Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill Obrien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. And here he is now, Dr. Bill Obrien.
Thank you, Agnes, and welcome to this Monday edition of the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is Monday, the 8th of October in the year 2018. It is a pleasure to be with you. We are live, in spite of the fact that we didn't do live programs last week. We are live today, and I want to spend a little bit of time at the beginning of the program trying to explain last week what happened last week. But before I do, I want to let you know how happy I am to be here, how honored I am to be here. But like everybody else, and I think I probably speak for a lot of those of you that are tuned in today. I haven't recovered from the weekend yet in terms of the Kavanaugh situation, and we'll be continuing to talk about that. But it's pretty deflating. In fact, in my case, it was almost unbelievable. I couldn't believe what I was watching and hearing. But at the same time, I've talked to a number of people who really aren't surprised, and when I think about it, I'm really not surprised either. I guess my optimism, my hopes became so strong that they were blurring my effort to deal with reality. I put a posting on Facebook and basically said in the very first line, I really expected better from Susan Collins. And as I've thought about it, I probably shouldn't have, but I did. And I sat there and I listened to her entire 45-minute dissertation on why she voted for Brett Kavanaugh. It was and a number of people have said this, it was a scholarly piece of work. It included references to specific court decisions and specific cases. It contained quotes, relied an awful lot on court precedent, and it was so overwhelmingly solid that the one conclusion that I drew after hearing it was, no way in the world did she write that last night for presentation at 3 o'clock today. That baby took some research and some time, and obviously she didn't do it because she wouldn't have had that time. So obviously her staff did it. And those with legal minds on her staff pulled that together for her. And obviously it took time because it was that well structured and that well argued. And of course, the first thing that occurred to me was she's been saying for days that she hadn't made up her mind, that she was still open. All the while, this particular masterpiece was being created. So in reality, given what it said, and I just want to touch on a few things about it, given what it said, it made me realize that she had made up her mind to vote for Brett Kavanaugh long before she announced her decision at 3 p.m. last Friday. And I think, and that masterpiece, if you will, proved it. And again, I'm using the word masterpiece, and I'm using it in, assumed quotation marks around it, because I don't necessarily mean that literally. Because one of the things that I became clear of during it was the fact that it was a masterful piece of writing and research on why one should and would almost have to vote for Brett Kavanaugh rather than against his confirmation. From the very beginning, it was a case in defense of a decision, clearly that she had made a long time before that, because that particular piece of work required a lot longer than a few hours from the time she made up her mind during the day on Friday or late on Thursday even. There's no way in the world you could put together anything like that in a day, in 24 hours, let alone 24 minutes, which was the implication she was giving, that she was still open and still hadn't made up her mind and all of these other things. It was very obvious that she strung the media and the nation along for days, when in fact her decision clearly had been made before. And I find that extremely disappointing as far as my thought, my sense of respect for Susan Collins. The one thing that I admired about her traditionally, always, was that she always seemed fair. She, and that's the argument, that's the case that she's made over and over again. Yet in each of those situations, when push came to shove, she voted as the leaders of her party expected her to vote. And what occurred to me very, very clearly during her entire speech is, where's John McCain? We need him now. He's not there. And it was very clear from the comments of Lindsey Graham that in spite of the fact that they were fast friends, very little of John McCain rubbed off on Lindsey Graham. And what there was, over the last couple of weeks, he's found a way to get rid of. And again, this sounds like sour grapes and all of that, and maybe to a degree it is. But it's extremely disturbing. And let me just make a comment. I did put this posting on Facebook, and I'm not going to go into all the details of it, but a few things that occurred to me during her presentation that I think is interesting. While many people have argued how balanced her case was, that she had gone to great lengths to pay tribute to Dr. Christine Blasey Ford. And she made specific references to the fact that clearly Dr. Ford had experienced a traumatic happening during this period. But her concern was, or Susan Collins's point was, that of the interviews the FBI did in its, quote, investigation, unquote, there seemed to be no corroborating evidence to corroborate what she said. So in effect, Susan Collins didn't directly accuse Dr. Ford of not telling the truth. What she did, in effect, was suggest, by implication, that she was indeed confused and mixed up, which, if you'll think about, a week earlier were the exact words of Chuck Grassley. So in a sense, Collins's efforts to pay tribute to Dr. Ford and to the pain that Dr. Ford obviously had experienced, sort of came up empty. But there's even more to it than that. Because the fact of the matter is the case was extremely one-sided. It wasn't a scholarly, objective consideration of the evidence to justify a particular conclusion. It was a cherry-picked piece of research designed to justify a decision that had already been made. In other words, what these people who put this together for Susan Collins clearly were asked to do was somebody whose mind had not been made up to do it. In other words, while she was telling the nation that she was struggling with a very difficult decision and she hadn't reached a conclusion, she had people doing research for her which were not charged to do that at all, to collect evidence. They were charged to pull together a case, an argument, in favor of a yes vote for Brett Kavanaugh. So, in a sense, this was a very one-sided, ahistorical approach to scholarly research. It wasn't a decision based on the evidence. It was evidence compiled to support a decision that had already been made. That is dishonest. It's unfair. And to hold the nation at bay for several days, knowing that your vote is, excuse me, that your vote is critical to the final conclusion, is shameful, I believe. And so, and that's essentially what I have to say on that. The best piece of evidence that I can give you for that is the one fact that everybody heard in Dr. Ford's testimony, beyond a doubt, beyond the shadow of a doubt, was Dr. Ford's statement that she was 100% sure that Brett Kavanaugh had been her attacker, that she knew him, she recognized him, she had been in his company before, and she knew exactly who it was that was attacking her. That piece of evidence, it seems to me, without being refuted in a case like that presented by Susan Collins, stands unchallenged. In her 45-minute presentation, Susan Collins never mentioned that. In effect, then, that statement, unchallenged, refutes, I believe, everything that Susan Collins said. Yes, the evidence that her people pulled together for her did justify a vote for Brett Kavanaugh, provided you never consider or even acknowledge the reality of evidence that points in the other direction. And Dr. Ford's response to a committee, to a questioner, Democratic questioner, how certain are you that it was Brett Kavanaugh that did this? Her response was 100%. It seems to me that it really does more than refute the case that Susan Collins presented. It also suggests what her presentation was, what Susan Collins's presentation was and what it was not. It was an argument to support a decision that had already been reached. It was not an effort to pull together the evidence and let the chips fall where they may. Let the evidence lead one to a fair, objective conclusion. And that was very evident throughout the presentation. And there were other examples of pieces of evidence that were not given due credit in her presentation. And one of them was the nature of the so-called FBI investigation, the response to Jeff Flake's proposal for an investigation. The evidence had already come out that legal advisor to President Trump, McGahn, had made the comment to the president that a freewheeling open investigation by the FBI on Brett Kavanaugh would likely defeat him. And the president responded or acted accordingly. This particular situation, I think, did as much damage to the FBI as it will do or has done to the nation. And, you know, I will get back to this in a moment, but I kind of had that on the tip of my tongue, and I kind of wanted to get out before we even got too far into the program. I'm very disappointed, and I'm forced to concede those who expected nothing else from her. I hope for more. Basically, her presentation, this is one of the things I said in my Facebook posting. When she said that the confirmation process for Supreme Court justices has gone downhill, has deteriorated, she blamed only one side for that deterioration. She was determined to emphasize the fact that prominent Democrats came out early in the process against President Trump's nominee, even before that nominee was named. What was not mentioned is the fact that even though the nominee was not named, when Chuck Schumer and some of the others basically came out and suggested they wouldn't support the president's nominee, it was because the list of possible candidates wasn't generated by the White House. Rather, it came from the Federalist Society and the Heritage Foundation. This was a list approved ahead of time for the president by other organizations, which really points to a less than honest effort by the White House, by the president, to do his due duty in vetting nominees. What he did was trust that vetting was done by a group that he politically supports. Whether in fact they vetted him or not. In other words, the president's thinking was, if they say that everybody on this list is acceptable, then I can go from there. It's against that many Democrats came out and said they would have to oppose the nomination. Of course, in the background is the whole Brett Garland thing. And the fact that Susan Collins emphasized the political nature of the confirmation process and suggested that Democrats were responsible but not Republicans is incredible. Anyway, I would love to hear from you. Let me give you the phone numbers and encourage you to take advantage of the opportunity to come on the air live with us. And then we'll get back into a few of these comments, because I do want to address the whole issue of last week's programming and why there weren't 3 live programs last week. As you know, we have a number of ways that you can communicate with us, and communicate and conversation is really what we hope to perform, what we hope to accomplish here at the Virtual Center. We have 2 phone lines that will take you directly into the Head On Radio Network studios. And if you call either of those 2 numbers, you'll get Agnes, who's in the studio today, and she will immediately connect you, and you'll be on the air and have your opportunity to speak or raise issues or concerns or questions or comments or whatever, whatever you feel would contribute to the overall mission of this program. Let me know that should you choose to do this, you are extremely welcome, and I am extremely grateful for your willingness to take advantage of this, what I think is a very, very important opportunity. The first number that I'd like to give you is one that we've had for some time. Area code 304-574-8178. 304-574-8178. And for the last several weeks, we've had a new line, a new number that will accomplish the same thing. It's the same area code, 304, and the number is 640-2829. 640-2829. Ironically, and it's just a happenstance, but actually, as I look at those 2 numbers, I think the second one is probably easier to remember than the first one. But either one of them will work. If you're a little bit uncomfortable or reluctant to come on the air, but you'd like to share your thoughts with us anyway, then I invite you to get in touch with me directly, either via email or on our Facebook page. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906@gmail.com. That's all one word, lowercase. It's the same email address that I've had since we've been on the air. It hasn't changed. And I'm guessing that those of you who listen regularly by now are probably tired of hearing me give that email address each day. But I like to believe that, that occasionally we will have new listeners, and for them this is important information. We also have a Facebook page. And for those of you who are familiar with or users of Facebook, and millions are, then you know that to get to Facebook, you just, on your browser, on your computer, just type in facebook.com. That'll take you to the home page. And on the home page, there's a search box at the top. And if you type in the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution, you'll be onto our Facebook page, and there are a number of postings on that Facebook page. And recently, over the last 2 or 3 or 4 days, I've put several postings on that Facebook page, 3 or 4 or 5 maybe. So I do invite you to check those postings out. With each of them comes 2 links, 2 boxes with each post. One of them is a share link, If you click on that, that means that that particular posting is automatically shared with your friends on Facebook. If you click on the comment button, that will give you an opportunity to comment directly to me, theoretically, about that particular posting. But in reality, you can use that opportunity to say whatever there is about the program that you would like to say, or whatever issue you would like to comment on. In other words, you can use our Facebook page not only to respond to the postings, but as a way to communicate directly with me. And it's maybe a little bit more efficient and a little bit easier than an email, remembering the email address. But again, the most important thing is that we hear from you and we have an opportunity to know your thoughts. Our other listeners need to hear your ideas, your thinking on some of these issues, because they're that important. And that gives us the opportunity to respond to you. And it's that kind of interaction, that kind of back and forth, that I think constitutes the essence of learning. So with that, I want to begin today's program, even though I already began it with the Susan Collins thing. But I said that because I didn't want to spend a whole lot of time on it, to be honest with you. I probably spent more time than I should have, because everybody knows what she said and what happened as a result. And the fact that Brett Kavanaugh was confirmed. And many of you know that the other yes vote that came at the same time on Friday was Joe Manchin, the Democrat from West Virginia, who held it open and said he hadn't made up his mind, went back Friday morning, in fact, to go through additionally portions of the FBI report. And basically what he said, Manchin's comment was, or is, that his conclusion was that Kavanaugh is an accomplished jurist. And of course, he has a track record to prove it, and on and on and on. So obviously, Manchin is in a state which voted overwhelmingly for Donald Trump in 2016. 43%, I believe, was the margin of victory over Hillary Clinton in West Virginia. So Manchin's efforts to get reelected to the United States Senate would seem to depend on his ability to avoid direct confrontation with President Trump or with those who support President Trump. And so therefore, a vote not to confirm Kavanaugh for him was politically suicide, I believe he probably concluded. It could end up being suicide anyway, because the irony of the situation is the polling indicates that here in West Virginia, Joe Manchin is quite a bit ahead of his Republican opponent, Patrick Morrisey, already. And in fact, his vote for Kavanaugh might cost him some of that support. So my guess is that the margin revealed by the polls in the next couple of weeks between him and Morrisey, his challenger, will probably decrease, because his act is going to lose a lot of support that he already had. On the other hand, as a West Virginia voter, I basically am facing the issue come November 6th, or voting for Joe Manchin, voting for Morrisey, or not voting at all in that particular election. And not voting for Manchin is in effect a vote for Morrisey. So despite did over the Brett Kavanaugh vote, confirmation vote, I still find myself in a position where I'm probably going to have to vote for him. And the irony of the situation is, in my case, that I do like Joe Manchin. I've met him several times. I have a couple of pictures with him here in my study where I'm broadcasting from. He and I had a mutual friend who passed away a little over a year ago, who was one of my best friends for 40 years, and was also very close to Joe Manchin and Mrs. Manchin. And it was at birthday parties for this mutual friend that Joe Manchin and I met 2 or 3 different times. And there were other occasions as well. So I like Joe Manchin, but I'm extremely disappointed in what he's done in this particular case. But be that as it may, that's the way it is. Let me get to the issue that I mentioned at the very outset, which is the fact that we didn't do a live broadcast last week at all. This was my problem, and it was a problem that I had to deal with, and it was as much psychological as anything else. And it relates directly to this program. Because for the last several years, we've been doing this program now. We're halfway into our 6th year. And for 5 years in a row, I've been keeping tabs on the expenses, on my personal expenses that are devoted to this program, to this broadcast. In order to prepare for these programs, I am subscribing to a number of publications that I probably wouldn't subscribe to otherwise. I've been reading the Washington Post and the New York Times for years, for example. The Boston Globe I grew up with. I've been reading that my whole life. The LA Times. I don't read that much, although I became pretty supportive of a couple of the op-ed people, the columnists there. But when this program came around, I wanted to make sure that I was surveying some of the best commentary on the issues of the day in preparation for this program. So I've subscribed to the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, the Boston Globe, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And from these publications, and they're not all liberal publications either, because the Washington Times is a regular read of mine as well. It's a daily. I always read it in conjunction with the Washington Post because it's the same time, it's the same town, different sides of the same issue. And over the last couple of years, I've been a subscriber to the Charleston Gazette, the state newspaper here in West Virginia. And there's a personal reason for that, because I've had a number of publications in that paper since I retired in 2013, in excess of 40 op-ed pieces that have been published in that paper. In fact, there's one in this morning's Charleston Gazette, by the way, for those who are interested, on the issue of impeachment. It really is kind of a compilation of many of the things we did over the last couple of weeks here on the issue of impeachment and how the founders looked upon it and what the founders said in ratifying conventions and various things like that. It was published this morning. And the fact that it was on the Brett Kavanaugh situation and related to impeachment was, I think, very, very interesting, because I had to go back and do some last-minute revision, because when I submitted the article, Brett Kavanaugh had not been confirmed. When the article was due to come out, he had been confirmed. So I had to make a few editorial changes before it was published, but it was published this morning. For those of you who might be interested in looking at it, the website is wvgazette.com. Anyway, I've been subscribing to these publications, some of them not as quite as long as others, since we started to do this program on a regular basis. Time, I had this list of what I thought were legitimate deductions for expenses in producing this program. And part of the reasons I felt justified in doing that is because I don't I don't get paid for doing this. I do it because I love it. But I want to be able to do a job that does due justice to the Head On Radio Network, to Bob Kincaid and Agnes and the rest. So I work harder putting these programs together than I did preparing and delivering classes when I was teaching full time. And I've learned an awful lot from the research and the results. So not only do I read these publications, but I'm going back through the historical material that I've had over the years, the Federalist Papers, and and all the things we've talked about, the Jefferson Letters and the Madison Papers and Washington Papers and all of those. And the combination of the historical background work and keeping up with what's coming out in terms of current issues and events constitutes some pretty significant time and research. All of which leads to the fact that I've had a tax preparer doing my income taxes for more than 30 years. And last year he retired. And I knew that we were going to have to find somebody new to do our taxes this year. And I really didn't know anybody. I didn't have anybody in mind, but my wife knew somebody because she knows a CPA who has an office right near where she works. And she said, I've never talked to her about business or anything, but I know she does taxes for a number of businesses in town. And I'll just approach her and see if she'd be willing to work on our taxes. So, to make a long story short, she did that, and the woman agreed to do our taxes for us, and we submitted the materials to her to do our taxes. Turns out that even though we had our materials submitted to her well before the April 15th date this year, our 27, we're talking about our 2017 tax returns. We submitted them before the April 15th, 2018 due date for the IRS. We submitted them in late March. And at the very last moment, she informed my wife that she was going to have to take an extension for us because she had a number of regular business clients, that she really had to complete. She wasn't sure she could take on ours and complete it in time. And it didn't bother us. We didn't care whether it was an extension or not. The bottom line is we took the extension, and now the taxes are due the 15th of this month, which is a week from today. Last week, the end of the week before last, after we completed our week's program, my wife got a call at work from this woman whose office is next to the when she had a moment. So my wife went over and she gave her the news. And it was that we were going to take a substantial income tax hit this year. It was quite upsetting to both of us because in all the years I've been filing income tax, since I got my first job at 14 years old, I never had to pay. I always got a refund. In all the years I've been paying since I've been married, we've always gotten a refund. Not a lot, but always enough to make the keeping of this data worthwhile. And I was a little bit concerned when I began to see the Trump tax bill that was passed, that was signed last December, because it's going to eliminate a lot of the deductions that I've been taking for years. And a major one has been the expenses that directly pertain to this particular program. The subscriptions, print cartridges for computer, the costs of the internet for delivery of the program, the subscription to cable, a portion of which is devoted to doing research. I am a regular fan, for example, of C-SPAN's book, the weekend book reviews that C-SPAN regularly features. And so what I thought was a very fair proportion of my cable costs and my internet costs and all the rest of it, representing the proportion of time that went into preparation for this program, I counted as a general deduction as well as other things, meetings on ideas for the program, and actually driving to different places in order to check out some materials before I do a program. I've a couple of times have gone to our state capital, Charleston, and gone through the archives there for particular things. And I've done the same in Richmond, Virginia, which I know very well. I've gone there and done research because I'm very familiar with the libraries there, because I lived there for 15 years. And I became very comfortable doing research there. So bottom line is, anyway, the result was that this new person doing our taxes informed my wife that I needed to know that none of these expenses were deductible. Because for me, this program IRS considers to be a hobby. It's something I want to do, not something I have to do. And the whole nature of the income tax structure, as she explained it to us, is built around a job, built around an income. That it is the money you earn that is taxed. And if you experience a loss, then you can take the difference between the amount you've paid and the amount you've lost. But all of it presumes the desire to earn an income. And since I'm not taking an income for this program, that means that none of the costs of presenting it are deductible. They all fall under the category, the IRS category of hobby. I was absolutely devastated. I need to tell you. My initial reaction was to cancel all the subscriptions. I actually started to do that. I canceled a few. I had made up my mind that I probably wasn't going to do another program because I was going through a psychological battle with how fair this was, and whether in fact this is part of the efforts to keep progressive liberal voices off the air. And I went through all of these things. And I was so upset and so disturbed that I couldn't put a program together. I just couldn't. And I contacted Bob and Agnes and explained to them the situation. And they basically encouraged me to take a few days and deal with it psychologically, which I did. And as we got into this weekend, I finally reached the conclusion that to not do this program would cost me more than it does doing it. So even though I'm on a fixed income, I'm going to figure out how for as long as I can continue to do it. And my wife is the one that encouraged me on this. She was really disturbed that I was even thinking about eliminating the program. She said, "My God, that's your life." And I thought, well, that portion of it, it's over. And the only portion of it left is the part where I move. And once I stop moving, then it's all over. But I realized after a time that this is obviously morose, and and I couldn't give in to this. So gradually I began to kind of recover my sense of balance, if you will. But this was a hit that I just couldn't believe. I mean, it was almost like everything that I took for granted came up false. And, I just really didn't know which way to turn. And, and so anyway, that's really the reason for it. I mean, it was not physical. It's not a health issue, although it was on the edge of becoming a health issue because it bothered me that much. But anyway, I don't like to burden you with all of this personal stuff, but I feel that I owe you an explanation because I went a week without doing a program. And that's what I do here at the Virtual Center. As best I can, are 3 programs a week. And the fact that I didn't do them, I felt I owed you an explanation as to why, and that's why. So there we are. And, I don't do this I'm not trying to generate sympathy or empathy or anything else. But the one thing I've concluded as I thought about doing today's program, and I told Agnes I had a program, and I wanted to do one today anyway, and in the interim I would make up my mind as to what I would say on the air today. But I had a program in mind anyway, and I still do. I want to share it with you. I think it's pretty important. But in the meantime, one of the things that I've concluded over this last week is that it's made me realize just how important this program is to me. And the result is that it has kind of fired me more than ever to do the very best job I can to warrant the support that so many of you have kindly given me over the last 5.5 years. And I'm honored by it, and I'm somewhat driven by it. And it's become extremely important to me. And I think this past week, once I got out of my own way enough to see what was going on, I began to realize that this program means much more to me than even I thought. Because when I really started to deal with the reality of not doing it, I began to realize that I couldn't do that. That would be a disservice to everything I believe in and everything that I've done from throughout my life. To have things and skills over all of these years that people have helped me develop and work with me to help me improve, and then to willingly throw up my hands and say I'm not going to do it anymore. Once I realized that that's where I was, I began to appreciate how selfish this was, and I wouldn't do it. But if it suits you, then by all means feel free to forget everything I've said in the last 10 minutes, and we'll just kind of move on from there.
Bill,
yes.
Could I pop in here for just a moment?
Oh, go ahead, Agnes. Yes.
This isn't just for you; it's for the listeners. What you've provided here over the years is civics, something that children don't get in school very much of anymore at all. And it's invaluable. You're invaluable especially now with what's going on. What you do, there's no amount of money that could replace it. And what civics means is we have to support it. That's what makes our country what our country is. And when it's not talked about, when it's not examined and thought out, then we end up in the situation we are now. So you're a lifesaver in so many ways. That's not me blowing smoke or trying to soothe an ego. What you bring to the table is monumentally important, and we need more of it. And I don't say that just because I'm your producer.
Well, no, I appreciate that, Agnes. You don't know how much.
Well, I just want you to know, and it's shared. There are children listening to your podcasts that are trying to get a well-rounded education. So what you do needs to be supported. I don't know how we're going to do it, but we're going to do it because you are invaluable to us, and we appreciate what you do. I just wanted you to know that.
I appreciate that. I thank you for that. And I will say the program that I have in mind that I want to do would be in our second hour, obviously, is material that I did put a posting on Facebook last Friday afternoon, addressing this.
I know the one you're talking about.
Yeah. And it's one that I really haven't done before. And when I was putting it together for my class, I had to make a decision. And that decision was, this really gets a little bit further into this material than a survey class like the one I'm teaching really warrants. There's not time for that because we're expected to cover a certain amount of material over the 15-week semester.
Right.
And if I go off onto tangents and get into nitty-gritty things like this, then it's probably going to cost me somewhere else, and I'm going to end up not doing something that I really should be doing. And I kind of had that debate with myself. And then I thought, well, there's much more to – I think that there's more to this than merely just my own appreciation for this particular period or my love for this particular period. I really think that this is an important thing for people to know. And once I realized that and did it in class – and the response I received, interestingly enough, was one of the best responses for any class that I've done so far this semester. Students really related to this.
You were teaching them something.
Well, it's something they had never heard. And I told them that, and it relates to things they have heard. But it's background information, and it really helps to put together a context which makes the things that they thought they knew assume totally different meaning and importance.
Exactly.
You know, and so basically once I reached that point, then I decided that I needed to do it on this program, and I sat down and put kind of a summary of it on Facebook last Friday because it's one of the postings there, because I really thought that it needs to be presented and digested and thought about, because it's a theme or a thesis that really needs to be examined and re-examined. And that's what I'm doing, and that's what I want to do the second hour today.
Well,
Agnes, thank you for your comments.
We love you, Bill.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I love you guys too. And I love this program and the people who do me the honor of listening to it. And I apologize for even thinking that I had the right to just throw up my hands and say, I'm not going to do this anymore. Because I might as well just take a gun and put it to my head. Because that's how serious that kind of a decision would be to me. So. And my wife helped me make that decision. We spent the weekend together and we talked about this, and that pretty much did it. And she kept saying, after all the years you've worked, if you can't afford to subscribe to a couple of newspapers, something's wrong. And then she told me a story. She'd kill me if she heard me saying this. But she told me a story one day that she was shopping with her mom when her mom was retired from school teaching after years of teaching. And she would take her mom shopping. This was a couple of years before her mom passed away. And they went to the grocery store, and her mom picked up a tomato, a big red juicy tomato. And my wife said, she told her and said, Mom, you can't afford that tomato. They're like $2.49 a pound or something. And my wife said that her mom looked at her and said, after all the years that I've worked, if I can't have a tomato, then what's it all about? Why even bother? And my wife said, from that point on, I never questioned anything she wanted to buy like that tomato. That story of that tomato stuck with me for the rest of her life. And as she said, it still sticks with me, and it applies now. So that's one of the things that's the kind of conversations we were having this weekend, which gets a little bit personal, but I think it explains the depth of this particular issue. And I appreciate Agnes's comment and her support and Bob's support and all the rest of it. You don't know how much I appreciate it. Let me and there's only a couple, 2 or 3 minutes left in this first hour. So I don't want to get into anything too deep right now because we're going to stop and take a break, 5-minute break. After that last 15 to 20 minutes, I think I probably need one today. But anyway, there was an article in the ago. Is a Tom Friedman article. And it was the second article in a 2-part series that he called the Second American Revolution. The Civil War, excuse me. The Second Civil War. And I had read the first one, and I remember it, and I never presented it on the air because I didn't think it said anything that most of us haven't already heard before. But the second one I thought was pretty powerful. And so I had it for a week, all last week, in preparation for doing something with it on the air. And then, of course, I wasn't doing programs, so I didn't do it, and I still have it. But I want to, recommend it to you. If you go back on the archives, the New York Times archives, the date is October 2nd. And all you need to do just look under the op-ed, the opinion columns in the New York Times online today. And under opinion, you'll see a list of the regular columnists. And just click on Tom Friedman's name, and it will have a list of all the columns he's done in the last several months. And this one is October 2nd, which means it's less than a week ago. So it would be right near the top. What makes it interesting is that Friedman is talking about America's transition into what he calls tribalism. And his point was, for a long time, we've been concerned about the extremes of partisanship. But tribalism goes beyond partisanship, because partisanship suggests 2 different points of view on some key issues, whereas tribalism suggests that the issues are so serious that there's no conversation, compromise, or negotiation possible, that the only way to deal with this other side is to destroy it, on the assumption that if you don't destroy it, it will destroy you. And so ultimately, tribalism makes politics a zero-sum game, where in order to win, somebody has to lose. And I think we saw that on display over the last week during the debates over Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation to the Supreme Court, in ways that I think bear it out. Friedman talks about that. And he talks about previous situations in this country's history when we were divided, seemingly divided so much that we might not be able to put it all back together again. He refers to the Vietnam era, to the civil rights movement, and various other things. And what he says is at that time there were certain things that held us together, that counteracted the growth or the extremism that was taking place in partisanship. And he mentions three. He said, for one thing, we had a growing middle class. People still believed in opportunity in this country. People still believed that they could create a chance at life for their children and grandchildren that was better than they had. That, in other words, the nation remained on a march forward. And it was still possible for people, no matter where they started from, to move into the middle class and live a successful, stable, rewarding life. But increasingly, we're losing that. Another thing we had that was holding us together was the Cold War, the threat of international communism. In spite of the fact that there were differences between liberals and conservatives, differences between Republicans and Democrats and independents, there was also this idea that we all faced a common threat, which was the threat of international communism. And that was enough in many cases to offset the things that divided us. And the other thing we had is a two-party system where both parties were sane. We've now reached a point where one of the two major parties has gone off the edge, has become rather insane. And so basically, we've lost the things that made it possible for us to come together at the same time that the pressures to divide continue to increase. And the result is we've moved from partisanship and extreme partisanship into something which most of the sociologists and political scientists call tribalism. And once you get there, contact, interaction, respect for the other side and the people who espouse it disappears, and they become the enemy. Last week, when Jeff Flake proposed the investigation, the FBI investigation, and asked for the week's postponement in the final vote on Kavanaugh, Flake made the comment, quote, "We Republicans have given in to the terrible tribal impulse that first mistakes our opponents for our enemies. And then we become seized with the conviction that we must destroy that enemy," unquote. Part of what he wanted to do with the week's postponement with the FBI investigation is kind of cool down the heat that was being generated by the controversy. Tom Friedman goes back and traces some of the origins of that controversy. For example, the August 2016 speech in which Mitch McConnell boasted, "One of my proudest moments was when I looked Barack Obama in the eye and I said, 'Mr. President, you will not fill the Supreme Court vacancy,' unquote." And he did it. You may have heard, since the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation vote, Mitch McConnell appearing on the Sunday talk shows and making the comment yesterday that he has a debt of gratitude to pay to his opponents because they were able to do what he was unable to do. And that is to energize the Republican base. Because what they were doing was to act in ways that reminded him of the French resistance against the Nazis when they controlled France during World War II. In other words, the extremism of those opposed to Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation, McConnell was saying, in effect, made Republicans realize why it was so important to get this man confirmed. And they did it. And we've probably seen stories this morning about members of the Republicans in Congress and the Senate drinking beers for Brett, and all of these other things, and gloating on the victory they've achieved this weekend. And of course, the reality is the victory they achieved this weekend is political control over the judicial branch of government, which flaunts the very structure of the Constitution of the United States. Because not only have they been able to engineer the destruction of the legislature's congressional balance of power to counteract or to check the powers of the executive branch of the president, but now they've been able to take control of the judicial branch as well. And instead of appreciating the depth and severity and the potential implications of what has happened in this country to our government, they are gloating over it and celebrating it. In effect, they delivered a blow to America's constitutional system that may be one we're going to have difficulty recovering from. That's why I think Friedman's article is so very important. And with that, if you'll indulge me for a moment, let's pause and take our 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll get into the issues in the program that I talked about earlier. You're listening to the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We're going to pause for 4 or 5 minutes, and then we'll be right back. Please stay with us.
We now return to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Here's your host, Dr. Bill Obrien.
Thank you, Agnes. You caught me with a mouthful of coffee, and I apologize for that. Welcome to our second hour. It's a little bit late, I know. It's 13 minutes after the hour, but we still got, better than 45 minutes left in today's program. So it gives us an opportunity to do something with this theme, which I've come more and more to believe is so important that I can't believe that I didn't really develop it before. But I didn't, and I've known it for years. And the reason I've known it is because my advisor in graduate school, Merrill Jensen, in his first book entitled The Articles of Confederation, came up with this story and did the research. And his book ultimately became a classic. And one of the first things I did in graduate school, obviously, was read his book. And so I was familiar with this theme from the very beginning, but I never really thought of it in terms of this program until I presented it in class last Friday. And I told my class that I had debated whether to do this or not because I didn't know whether I could justify surrendering an entire class because this was so internally specific to the particular period that it's not in any of the books, any of the textbooks, and it's not really considered. And part of the reason it's not really considered is because it's so darn explosive. I think it is, anyway. I think it's extremely meaningful. And the reason it's meaningful is because it establishes a theme which is consistently pursued throughout the period into and concluding with the ratification of the Constitution itself. In other words, what we're talking about here is the debate over a strong central government versus states' rights. And we've been making off and on references to the issue of states' rights off and on in this program since we began 5.5 years ago. But as we know, the issue of states' rights is still a big one, a major one in our thinking and in our politics. And increasingly, it's been tied up with the issue of race. And the reality is that when it first began to surface in the colonial period itself, it was decided it was in part related to the issues of race because it touched upon the realities of slavery. And the fact of the matter is, we know that Jefferson's effort to include in the Declaration of Independence a criticism of Great Britain, of the mother country, because for purposes which were totally beneficial only to them, the mother country instituted the slave trade in America, which brought tens of thousands and ultimately hundreds of thousands of captured slaves into this country in order to complete the kind of labor force needed to turn Southern agriculture into a profit-making venture, which is what the colonies were all about. The reason that the Southern colonies and then the Southern states fit perfectly into Britain's decision to go into the colonial business in the first place was because with the introduction of tobacco, first in Virginia and then in Maryland, and then later on the introduction of sugar in the Caribbean and rice production in the Deep South, South Carolina, and Alabama and Georgia and places like that, these basically generated the wealth which fulfilled the goals of colonialism for the mother country. And the amount of wealth pouring into the mother country as a result of the agricultural production in the South and the introduction of slave labor to produce that wealth ultimately became a major contributor to Great Britain's status as the major imperial power in the world at that time. And all of this became an accomplished fact with the end of the French and Indian War in 1763, which was actually a world war between Great Britain and France. The defeat of France and the conquest of North America by the British in 1763 ultimately settled Great Britain as the acknowledged major imperial power in the world at that time. And part of that power, a major part of that power, is the control of wealth that the empire was able to manage in its own best interests. And once Great Britain reached that point of international power in 1763, it's only then that Great Britain, the mother country, believed that the next step in this process was to rein in her New World colonies, which had pretty much been allowed to go their own way for a long time, because Great Britain, the mother country, had never successfully been able to develop a colonial policy sufficient to adequately manage an empire that was 3,000 miles away from the mother country. And so many people who write the story of American independence focus on the degree to which American independence kind of establishes or marks the failure of Britain's ability to manage her New World empire. And there's no question that when Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, he basically did it from that same perspective. That the fact that these colonists are British subjects, subjects of the King of England, and are to be treated as British subjects. And that the Parliament in its legislation has violated the rights of British subjects, of citizens, subjects of the King, in ways which Jefferson listed in the Declaration of Independence, in the list of specific charges leveled against the King, which Jefferson argued justified the colonists' right to be independent. Jefferson's argument clearly before the world was it's England's fault that we're doing this, not ours. We're being forced to take this as kind of a last resort. And so Jefferson's Declaration of Independence was in fact his justification before the world for the fact that these colonies had a right to be independent. In other words, Jefferson's Declaration of Independence was his case for independence. And the mother country was the aggressor, the perpetrator. The colonies were the victims. But here's the point. Even though the war for independence began in New England, in and around Boston, in 1775, April of 1775, marked most clearly by the battles of Concord and Lexington, and ultimately the evacuation of Boston by the British on April 19th, 1776. The fact of the matter is, the war was underway for 14 months before members of Congress were willing to declare colonial independence and asked Jefferson to be on a committee to draft a Declaration of Independence. The issue that I'm focusing on is the fact that it took 14 months for the colonists to make the decision to go for independence, even while the war was on, even while Americans and British citizens, soldiers, were dying on the battlefield. And the question I raise is what took so long? Why so reluctant? Why was the Continental Congress trying to petition the king over and over and over again to back off, to intercede on their behalf with Parliament? Please don't make us do what you're forcing us to do. It was not until July 1776, April 1775 to July 1776, before the Declaration of Independence was passed and approved. And in that declaration, Jefferson listed a series of particular charges against the king, violations of their rights as British subjects, violations of their rights as citizens, violations of the British Constitution. In a sense, the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson organized almost as bills of impeachment. In effect, colonial independence was their decision to impeach the king for the following reasons. It was a PR document, but in order to get it passed by 13 colonies up and down the coast, Jefferson was forced to make compromises. And one of the compromises he was forced to make was to eliminate all references in it to slavery, to the slave trade. And he was forced to eliminate that charge against Great Britain, which was aimed at blaming Britain for the slave trade and for the racial situation that these colonies find themselves in, because the mother country allowed for profit purposes tens of thousands and ultimately hundreds of thousands of captured slaves to be brought into this country, and left it up to the colonies to figure out how to deal with it. The Southern delegates demanded that all references to the institution of slavery be deleted from the Declaration. At the same time the Declaration of Independence was passed, in July of 1776, Congress appointed a committee to draft a constitution, a form of government that would join the 13 colonies together, because they had to unite in order to successfully fight the war. They didn't have much of a chance anyway, but if they didn't work together, they didn't have a chance at all. In response to that, Congress appointed a committee of 13 members of Congress. And the chair of that committee was John Dickinson, of Pennsylvania. John Dickinson was one of the most noted attorneys of the time. He was also extremely conservative. He was the leader of the conservative wing within Congress. And one could expect that the draft of what becomes the Articles of Confederation that came from the Dickinson Committee, the so-called Dickinson draft, would in effect be an effort to create a super strong central government, because the conservatives had already gone on record and established themselves by their behavior in Congress as being very uncomfortable to declare independence from the mother country until the colonies had created a central government to replace the mother country, because they were afraid of what a Declaration of Independence would cause to happen within America. They were afraid that a Declaration of Independence would unleash civil war in America. It would cause the poor and disenchanted in every colony to rise up against the power structure within that colony, or with the Declaration of Independence within that state. And throughout colonial history, there had been a history of eruptions that were based increasingly on a growing sense of social stratification in America, clear class differences between the wealthy and the poor. The conservatives were unwilling to go for independence until there was a government to replace England, because they realized that it was the mother country and the military prowess of the mother country and loyalty to the king that kept law and order in the colonies. And to declare the right to overthrow that government to conservatives was asking for trouble, because what you were doing was legitimizing the right to take up arms and overthrow government to people whose number one priority would be to overthrow it, because they were losing in terms of the quality of life under the existing system. Members of the West, for example, were exposed to the Indian threats. And in spite of having to deal with Indian raids and violence on the frontier, they never could get Eastern powers, Eastern representatives in their legislatures to defend them, to take up arms against the Indians and protect them. Turns out that one of the reasons why is because of a number of the business interests in the eastern parts of these colonies had business and trade arrangements with the Indians. And the last thing they wanted to do was irritate them. So there were a number of issues that caused conservatives to be very reluctant to go for independence. And this is the story that Merrill Jensen unleashed so many years ago in the 1940s. I think his dissertation was first published in 1940 on the Articles of Confederation. And that was that even though Congress seemed to break down between conservatives and radicals, and again, it's a misnomer to call those who supported independence radicals, because they weren't. Patrick Henry, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, John Hancock, these were very prominent, wealthy people. They aren't radicals in the classic sense of the term, the way we use it today. They were conservative people who were willing to risk independence in order to secure their freedom from British control. That doesn't mean that they wanted to totally destroy the existing social structure. They weren't radicals in the classic definition of the term. They were conservative people who didn't believe that you had to have a strong central government in order to keep the lid on socially and politically. But as Jensen points out, what created problems for the conservatives was that they were internally divided amongst themselves. Because some conservatives were states' rights advocates. Some conservatives believed that you could risk independence as long as you had a strong state government to replace England. That if you had a strong state government in the hands of the right people, with the right people in control, you could maintain order. You could keep the Indians down, so to speak, if you know what I mean. Keep the masses under control. Let me give you an idea as to how significant this is. One of the leading advocates of states' rights, and a leading conservative as well, was Edward Rutledge of South Carolina. And in a letter to John Jay, his friend, who was an attorney in New York, Rutledge spoke of New England's overriding or overruling influence in council. They were afraid of the New Englanders because New Englanders wanted independence. New Englanders believed in democracy. They believed the spirit of the Declaration of Independence, that all men were created equal and everybody ought to have an equal chance, and all these other things that Jefferson talked about. These people didn't believe it. They were concerned with the influence of New England in Congress because they were afraid that New Englanders tended to believe these things. They saw them as being too radical. And Rutledge made the point that New England's overruling influence in council, their low cunning, and those leveling principles, which men without character and without fortune in general possess, which are so captivating to the lower class of mankind, unquote. Rutledge was concerned that New England was spouting ideology which appealed to the masses, which appealed to men of lesser position. Oftentimes, he says they were leveling principles. In other words, they were ideas that we ought to close the gap between rich and poor, that many of the people who held their positions because of their wealth and influence didn't deserve those positions, that these positions of power ought to be earned, not inherited, because of who your parents were or where you grew up. And Rutledge talked about how appealing these leveling principles were to men without character and without fortune, that are so captivating to the lower class of mankind. In other words, the ideas coming out of New England were dangerous. They threatened to disrupt the structure of society itself. And so therefore, these people were very concerned that if we ended up with a strong central government to replace England, New England would control that government because of its population, because of the number of people there. The fear was, among Rutledge and other Southerners, that a strong central government would eventually fall under the control of New England radicals. And the thing that Southerners wanted to protect more than anything else was their slaves, the institution of slavery. They were afraid of a strong central government because they were afraid of what a strong central government could do to the institution of slavery. What would keep a Congress controlled by New England from efforts to abolish slavery entirely and turn these hundreds of thousands, millions of unwilling slaves loose upon us? We'd have a race war on our hands. Consequently, these Southern conservatives became advocates of states' rights and were opposed to the idea of a strong central government. Therefore, they were very distrustful of a committee to draft a central government chaired by John Dickinson, because though he was a conservative, John Dickinson was from Pennsylvania. John Dickinson was an advocate of strong central government, and these Southern conservatives were afraid of a strong central government because of what it might do to the institution of slavery. So therefore, you had this division between states' rights and nationalism, as it were, within the conservatives themselves in Congress. Turns out that New England was more than willing to support states' rights if it was a way to weaken or threaten the control of the very wealthiest people of the aristocracy. And so what you ended up with in Congress was an intriguing alliance between New England radicals and Southern conservatives on the issue of states' rights. And this struggle was revealed in Dickinson's efforts to draft the Articles of Confederation. I want to share with you this story. When Dickinson's committee released its first draft of the Articles of Confederation, it made it very clear that this was a confederacy, and its title would be the United States of America. But have you ever thought about the meaning of the term the United States of America? If you put the emphasis on United States, it's a confederacy. If you put the emphasis on America, it's a national government. So by labeling this government, this country, the United States of America, Dickinson's committee seems to be giving credit, giving power, if you will, a concession to the states' writers by talking about United States. And then in Article 3 of this document, it reads as follows: each colony shall retain and enjoy as much of its present laws, rights, and customs as it may think fit, and reserves to itself the sole and exclusive regulation and government of its internal police in all matters that shall not interfere with the articles of this confederation. That's Article 3 of Dickinson's draft. If you read it very carefully, it really is not a concession to states' rights at all. It appears to be, because it said each colony, each state, shall retain and enjoy as much of its present laws, rights, and customs as it may think fit. But it doesn't guarantee them these rights, these laws. What it does do is reserve to the states the sole and exclusive regulation and government of its internal police. In other words, each state retains control of its own militia, of its own internal army and police. But you got to look at that as a lawyer would look at it. When you create a system of government linking together a number of states into a union of some kind, even if you call it a confederacy, if you guarantee these states exclusive power over their own internal police, you are implying that every other power not reserved to the states belongs to the central government. In other words, what the Dickinson draft does is seem to be a concession to states' rights, but is in reality the creation of a national government. By guaranteeing the states one power and one power only, you create by implication the idea that that's the only power they have a constitutional right to. Everything else belongs to the states. But the fact of the matter is, nobody saw this for a long time. The Articles of Confederation was created. The Dickinson draft was released to Congress in late 1776. The Articles are not ratified until much later, 1781. And the acknowledged reason for that is control of Western development. Certain colonies, like Virginia, for example, when their original charters were issued by the British king, were given controlling land as far as it went until it reached the Pacific Ocean. Later colonies, like Maryland, had specific boundaries. And what the states without land, without Western lands, were afraid of is that with states' rights, the major owners of Western development, like Virginia, would control the nation because they would be by far the biggest and the most powerful. So Maryland refused to agree to the Articles of Confederation until states like Virginia agreed to turn over their Western lands to the new government, to the new Congress. And that didn't happen until 1781, and it's only then that the Articles were ratified. But just before that, in 1780, under annual elections, a representative showed up in Congress from North Carolina named Thomas Burke. Thomas Burke was born in Ireland. He was a doctor, a physician, a medical doctor. And he migrated to North Carolina from Ireland. And he was elected to represent North Carolina in the Continental Congress. And when he arrived, he immediately became enmeshed in the debates over the Articles of Confederation. And he spotted the flaw in Article 3. And so he got on his feet in early 1781, read Article 3 to the members of Congress, and made the same point that I just made. That since Article 3 guarantees one specific power to the states, by implication, it gives all other powers to the central government. And so Burke's point to Congress was, most of us delegates believe that in voting for this Dickinson draft, we're voting for a states' rights document because it reads like it is a states' rights document. But legally, it is not. And so what Burke does is propose an amendment to the Dickinson draft. And the amendment becomes Article 2 of the final Articles of Confederation. And Article 2, proposed by Thomas Burke, says the following: each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, and every power, jurisdiction, and right which is not by this Confederation expressly delegated to the United States in Congress assembled. Burke's amendment flips the Dickinson draft upside down. And what Burke says in his amendment is that the states retain every power not expressly granted to the central government. The word expressly is the key word. If it's not in the document, if it's not clearly given to the central government, it belongs to the states. What Burke did was totally reverse the psychology of Dickinson's Article 3. And with that amendment and the resolution of the Western land problem, Maryland gets on board. The Articles of Confederation is ratified in 1781 and becomes the law of the land, the Articles of Confederation. And finally, it's still called the United States of America. But the new Article 3 says that this creates the states hereby enter into a firm league of friendship with each other for their common defense, for the security of their liberties and their mutual and general welfare. And then the document proceeds to mention the powers that the central government doesn't have, that the states keep: the power to tax, the power to print money, the power to regulate trade. In other words, everything that would generate an income for Congress and render them independent from state control is in the Articles of Confederation. And so this becomes clearly a states' rights document, no question. You couldn't interpret it any other way. Basically, what I would like to emphasize is the fact that the Dickinson draft revealed the effort of nationalists to slip in a strong central government by the states' writers. And Thomas Burke caught it. Thomas Burke recognized it. Consequently, the Confederation period is a period where all power is in the hands of the central government. We'll go back and continue this tomorrow because we've got about 5-6 minutes left in today's program. But let me just add one more point. Not only does the Congress create a committee to draft an Articles of Confederation, a Constitution in 1776, but also Congress advises each colony that with independence, we are no longer colonies. We are free and independent states. And therefore, each state legislature must take it upon itself to draft its own constitution. Because we are creating a government, a confederacy, a league of friendship between states that are independent and sovereign. That means that they have to have their own political structures, their own constitutions. So each state is encouraged to write its constitution, and each state does. And while they are all different, because they apply to different states, there are common features in all of them. One common feature is they all have weak governors, if they have governors at all. The state of Pennsylvania doesn't even have one. So suspicious of these people, of a strong, abusive central government, because that's what they're fighting a war against for freedom from, is an abusive parliament, an abusive king. So they are really reluctant to create strong executives in their state constitutions. Most of them have governors, but these governors are rendered weak and dependent on the legislatures. Governors do not have veto power, for example. Governors do not have the power to call and adjourn the legislature. So a common feature of all of these state constitutions is that they all feature weak executive branches, or no executive branch at all, as is true in the case of Pennsylvania. The second thing they have in common, which goes along with this, is the power is in the legislative branch, not the executive branch. And there's no specific third branch, no judiciary as such. There's a court system, but it's appointed and reports to the legislature. So power under the Articles of Confederation is granted to state legislatures. A third common feature of these state constitutions is that they all have annual elections. Elected representatives are forced to stand before the people and be accountable every single year. Which means that if a particular representative doesn't do what his constituents ask him to do, they don't have to wait years to get rid of him. They get rid of him right away. And the fourth common feature of these state constitutions are property qualifications for voting and office holding. Each constitution includes a property requirement to vote. When you register to vote, you have to prove that you own property. In the state that I know best, Maryland, for example, 50 pounds worth of property. You had to be able to demonstrate that you own property valued at least 50 pounds. If you wanted to run for the legislature, you had to be able to demonstrate property valued at least 100 pounds. For the Senate, 500 pounds. For governor, 1,000 pounds. And while the numbers varied from state to state, the principle remained the same. Only those with property could vote, and only those with a lot of property could hold office. It was a guarantee that the right people would wield authority, wield power in these states. And that those without property, true radicals, the desperate, those with nothing to lose, could not participate in government. Because since they had nothing to lose, they would not behave as the kind of citizens a republic like ours would want. Only those with a stake in society, only those with skin in this game, a vested interest, can be trusted to participate in making the rules under which everybody lived. The thinking is people with property need to make the rules. And if we guarantee that the people making the laws have a lot of property, a lot to lose, they're going to rule wisely. And if they do, that's going to protect my property, however little I have. The most dangerous threat to property is from the people who don't have any. Indentured servants, slaves, the very poor, vagrants. These people are dangerous. The last thing you can afford to do is give them the right to vote. Let me end this with this comment. If you look at the structure of government, you look at the weak central government under the Articles, the clear guarantee and awarding of power to the states, and then you look at how power is distributed within the states, it's very clear that all power is in the legislative branch of government, that branch which is closest to the people. The governors are weak. Judiciaries as such don't exist. So there's no such things as ruling or law unconstitutional. And the elections are held annually. That means that under the Articles of Confederation, power was closer to the people than it had ever been in any government up to this time, and than it has been in any government since this time. The Articles of Confederation government was potentially the most democratic political system this nation ever had. And given the record that the conservatives within Congress had established in their fight over the Articles of Confederation, it became very clear that the conservatives could not accept this. They would have to do something to change it. It took them until 1787 to get enough states to come to a convention in Philadelphia, in theory, to revise the Articles of Confederation, but in fact, to abolish them. And we'll continue with that story on tomorrow's program. We've reached the top of the hour. Actually, I've gone a little bit over, and I apologize for that. For the Virtual Center, for myself, Bill O'Brien, and for the Head On Radio Network, Bob and Agnes and the folks there, thank you so very, very much for the opportunity to be with you today, and I invite you to come back tomorrow. And we'll continue this story. I think it's pretty interesting and pretty important. Have a wonderful, wonderful evening. And please do everything you can to join us tomorrow. We'll appreciate it a lot. Thank you.